And this is leading to the loss of the ecosystem services these habitats provide. So, one thing I'm going to pose to you is this question: can aquaculture save the planet? And this is me many years ago when I was in graduate school at a farm up in British Columbia. And one thing we do know is that seaweeds can feed a hungry world. A lot of areas of the world have diets that rely heavily on seaweed. What you may not know is that we're eating seaweeds every day. You don't go to your local market and intentionally buy seaweed products. Look for things that you do buy every day. And if you look at the ingredients on the back and you see things like carrageenan or agar or algin, these are seaweed products. I have my classes in marine botany, do something for the last day after we talk about industry, go to the store, look at the ingredients list, and you'll see seaweeds are in so many things we eat, right? Seaweeds are other things like agar. These things are not only in foods as well, but they're in biomedical research, right? And one thing to point out here is that if you look at what we're using seaweeds for, the majority of it is used for human consumption. And a small percentage is used for other things like fertilizers, animal feed, pharmaceuticals, cosmetics, biofuels. These things are growing. And so a couple of things I want to just walk us through what we actually use seaweed for, in case you haven't thought about this, right? Biomedical research, agar gels that we're looking at to find solutions to human health problems, right? This is some work I did with a Korean colleague. This is a green alga called ova. Ova is ubiquitous around the world, and it forms these huge green tides in the Yellow Sea, the China Sea. And we can take ova and extract, using a phenol, extract products from that. And we can actually use these things to look for solutions to poor human diets, basically colitis or intestinal bowel disease. And just a little bit of show you some work that we did. If you look at the cell viability relative to untreated controls, as you take this extract from ova and you increase it, we actually have things where we're seeing reduced activity of the cells of these tumor cousins. So we're seeing this extracts from seaweeds improving human condition and finding cures for things. And we can just eat this, and it can, just in our diet, it can improve human condition, right? And it doesn't take much, 0.15 to 0.3 grams a day. This is not much that we have to add, right? You've been to the dentist, you bite down on that squishy thing and they make dental impressions. This is a product called algae that we harvest from kelp, right? And you can just buy this stuff. We do things with kids where we actually make impressions of sea animals and stuff like this as well. But these things are, like I said, they're everyday products, right? The other thing that we're looking at is the climate is changing, right? This is fact. The oceans are warming and becoming more acidic, right? If you look at things like this, we're seeing that just over the last 60 or 70 years, this huge increase in atmospheric carbon dioxide. And if you look at this green, this is actually dissolving into the ocean, carbonating the ocean. And as we're carbonating the ocean, the pH of the ocean is going down. This is problems for things like coral reefs, which are huge, of huge importance to global ecosystems, right? You like oysters and shellfish. This is making things harder for them to build their skeletons. And it's affecting food distributions as well as global biodiversity, right? But we look at ways of taking up carbon. We all probably understood that terrestrial forests, rainforests, seasonal forests, boreal forests, evergreen forests, these things hold a lot of carbon in them. And when we cut them down, we lose them, we lose that ability to take it up. And they're really productive. But if you look over on the yellow, these are kelp forests. They hold almost as much carbon as terrestrial forests, and they have higher rates of primary production. They're cycling it more. So seaweeds can be hugely important for helping regulate global carbon cycle, right? Another thing about climate change, the warming of the atmosphere, is methane. Methane is actually a stronger greenhouse gas than CO2. One huge production of methane is farming, is cattle farming, cattle ranching, right? But one thing we know is that if we take this and we add seaweeds to the diets of kelp, and this is a seaweed called Asparagopsis taxiformis, and what this has is something that stops the terminal stage of methane production. It can reduce methane production in cows by almost 90%. That's just adding a little bit. So this is a nice picture. I'll break here to show you a little picture of a seaweed, right? The other thing is pollution, right? Single-use plastic. This is a problem in huge areas of the world where beaches look like this. Now, I've spent some time in Jamaica. I'm driving around the island. A lot of the beaches will look like this. Single-use plastics are a huge problem for pollution, right? But we can extract products from seaweeds and make reusable replacements for them. This is a company called Lolly Straw that can make straws and cutware, silverware out of plastics that actually come in flavor. Right? Surfboards. I surf. We can actually use seaweed extracts to help form the basis of things like surf. But the point is that we can extract things from seaweeds and use them as replacement for these problems that we have for global pollution, right? We just had a talk about this, not to go back on what's said, but things happen in the world, right? We have the issues with nuclear power. We also heard about the Fukushima Daiichi State, nuclear generating station, and the tsunami that hit following the earthquake, right? It did cause a meltdown, right? And this can put radiation into the atmosphere. And one thing you can say is take a pill. Really? Pill. Kelp contains iodine 127, right? The stable form. It could saturate your thyroid. It could prevent the uptake of radioactive. So it can do much more for us than things you probably have thought about. The point of this all is seaweeds have a lot of uses, right? And so one thing I want to talk about, I want to spend the last kind of portion of this talk talking about is pollution, and really nitrogen phosphorus pollution, right? And this is something that comes from agriculture and from urban use and fertilizing our gardens and our lawns, right? And so we have our agriculture pollution. We have it coming from industry. We've got it from a residential. And of course, there's always this, right? And so what happened is it rained. And this pollution then heads toward the ocean. If you've ever seen those little blue fish that's painted on things float to the sea, it does. It flows right to the ocean. And it takes all of this pollution and it can dump it into the ocean. And so this is go here. And so the question is, when these things are going into the ocean, the question we asked in my lab is, how does the decreased salinity, because the oceans are salty, the rain's freshwater, this freshwater is flowing into the ocean with all of this nitrogen and phosphorus coming out of these cities and residential areas and ag lands. And so how can this affect the growth of seaweeds? If we're going to use seaweeds to help clean up the ocean, which I'm going to talk about in a moment, got to do it during a time when it's fresh water. And so how does increased nutrients and decreased salinity affect these? Well, this is a program that we worked with the Port of San Diego, and you're going to hear from my colleague, Paula Silva, in a few minutes about the port. But the port was gracious enough and was good enough to help support a startup that I worked with, a company called Sunken Seaweed, where we started looking at these questions. Put in a seaweed farm on the Grape Street Pier. We started growing seaweed, right? And here, and this is one of my colleagues, Leslie Boer, who is a co-owner of Sunken Seaweed. And so if you take a look at the San Diego Bay, this is 2018. There's 1.4 million people in it, all around San Diego Bay, right? And so we started growing seaweeds on this farm, and we're growing different kinds. We're growing our giant kelps, which is something I have on my shirt right here. I wore especially for today. We're growing our gracilaria, our ogo, and we're growing this green alga called ulva, which is this sea lettuce. It's the same type of alga that I talked about for this green tides that we extracted using the polyphenol extraction, and we're able to help cure colitis. So we're looking at different seaweed, right? And we're asking which are the best ones. If we're going to try to grow seaweeds in San Diego Bay, and we're going to maybe use it to clean up San Diego Bay, and they're going to have to uptake that nitrogen and the phosphorus, and they're going to have to do well when fresh water comes. And so we posed ulva because it's pretty easy to culture and it's really resistant to different environmental conditions. So this is San Diego Bay. This is the Grape Street Pier where we put in a farm. And this is a picture. This is Tori. Belize here with one of the undergrad helpers from my lab. This is one of the stretches of the farm. You can see these baskets here where we put in ova. And we started looking at how does ova even behave out there? Does it take up nitrogen, phosphorus, and what's it going to do when it rains? And so to do this, sometimes when you're working in the field, things happen. It's sometimes a difficult place because you can't control for everything. So we went into my lab and we took ova and we began to culture ova in the lab. And we began to culture it under different salinities. We started mimicking those rain events. And we started mimicking that input of organic pollutants, nitrogen, phosphorus in particular. And then we looked at how ova performed. And we're interested, if we're going to use aquaculture, and we're going to grow seaweeds in the bay to do this, they've got to survive during these periods. And they've got to take up that nitrogen, phosphorus. And so, not a graph-heavy talk, but I'm going to show you a couple. We have our low salinity on the top and our high salinity on the bottom. We've got 3 levels of nutrients going from blue low, red medium, green high. And what you're looking at, if you look at the top and the bottom, they look pretty similar here. And if you look on the left and the right, the low salinity and the high salinity, the graphs look similar. What we see is when you have low nutrients, they don't grow as well. But once you bump those nutrients up, they grow, and they grow pretty similarly during these low salinity events when it's raining. So it certainly looks like all of it's pretty good when the rain events hit. Bumps the nutrients up, these things grow, they do pretty good. We then looked at various things in my lab where we looked at the photophysiology. Fancy way of saying we look at how the light comes in. We heard about, the sun reactor, this big fusion reactor, which sends out energy. Part of that energy is light, sends out a whole range of energy, but part of that is light. Plants utilize that light. We're all pretty aware that, when the sun's up, plants photosynthesize. Well, we measure this stuff in my lab. And part of that photosynthesis is the way they harvest that light. The other is what they do with that. And so we can measure how they harvest it. And we can look at things like the electron transport chain. So electron transport chain is part of the photophysiology. It helps make these energy-rich bonds that we then use later to make sugar. And we can see the left side and the right side are similar. They do better when the nutrients go up. We look at photophysiology efficiency. Left side and the right side are similar. It's better when nutrients go up. We can look at where they saturate, where that light saturates. Same story, left side and right side, similar. It's better when the nutrients go up. And then we can look at where they become photoinhibited. Photoinhibited would be like taking an indoor plant, putting it outside for an afternoon in the sun, and you kill it. There's too much light. And so the take home from this is these things tend to be harvesting light similarly, regardless of the salinity, and they tend to do better when the nutrients go up. Seems to make them an ideal candidate for bioremediation, for growing things to help solve that one other problem of pollution. And then so we can take these tissues that we grow and we can put them in a mass spectrometer, look at their elemental analysis. And we can look at carbon, left and right side, look and say there's not much of a pattern here. This isn't a carbon study. But if we look at nitrogen, phosphorus, same story. Left and right sides look similar. Salinity, low salinity doesn't appear to affect it. But when you bump nitrogen up, they take the nitrogen up into their tissue, right? When you bump the phosphorus up, they take the phosphorus up in their tissue. So what we concluded from this is all these other uses for seaweeds that I've talked about, the food, the cleaning, the biofilters, plastic, for doing things like industry, for doing things like medical research. These things are great for bioremediation as well. And as a collaboration with the port, we've been looking at this in a way of possibly using seaweed farms to help clean the port waters. And we can expand these things. Seaweeds have long been used in the effluents of industry to clean up some of those pollutants as they come out. It's going to work if we put these things on a farm as well. So, hopefully I'm convincing you that seaweed farming is a promising solution to some of the world's problems, right? We might call this regenerative ocean agriculture, right? Seaweed farming, right? We look at what's happening with seaweed farming. Went from 2006 to 2018, and we look at wild-caught seaweeds. It's maintained pretty standard, 2.3 billion pounds, and we're looking at seaweed farming increasing, doubling, tripling over this time. Seaweed farming is growing worldwide, right? Global status, still most of it is aquaculture. Very little of the seaweeds are wild anymore. There's just not enough alpha to harvest, and we have to figure out a way to grow it. And they're doing this all throughout the world. The seaweed farms here. This is a kelp farm. This is that farm up in British Columbia here, right? And this is a farm in Korea down by Wando, covered hundreds of acres. The rest of the world is really, really ahead of us in this. And you say, how much ahead of us? Well, look at who is the leading producers of seaweeds worldwide. It's Indo-Pacific countries. It's 86%, China and Indonesia. Philippines, South Korea lagging behind. I'm looking here. All other countries, 0.1%, 1/10 of 1%. The US doesn't appear here. The US is 1/10, or one country, all right? That's 1/10 of 1%. So this thing's a little here. All right. So I'm going to suggest that the seaweed's not meeting its potential here, right? Less than 1% of the global seaweed production happens here. 98% of the seaweeds we consume here are imported. This is adding to our $15 billion seafood trade deficit, not our trade deficit, our seafood trade deficit, right? We have many seaweeds of commercial interest. We have lots of them here. We have extensive nutrient-rich coastline. We have really well-established infrastructure and distribution channels. We have large markets. We should be growing seaweeds in the US, right? It is one of the fastest growing marine industries in the Northeast. Kelp farming is really growing. Greenwave, a company that's there, has really been instrumental in this, right? We've established two large aquaculture areas of opportunity, one here in California, the other in the Gulf of Mexico. Congress has recognized this, and they've established these areas where they want to see seaweed farming expand, right? So coastal aquaculture is really poised to undergo a tremendous expansion in the next decade. We just got to get behind it, right? Again, their seaweeds are marketable. They produce food, vitamins and minerals. They're good for fuel, biogas, and ethanol. They can be used for feed, for ranching. They could be replacements for plastic materials. They could work for the remediation, uptake of pollutants, and they can help restore our diminished ecosystems where we've been lost. Aquaculture is being used right now to grow things on farms, then use them to outplant where we've lost. 90% of our kelp beds are more in the Northern California coast. That's lost. That's closed the abalone fishery. The whole infrastructure is built around those things has collapsed. A lot of interest in restoring diminished kelp forests. Right? We're working on Catalina Island trying to do this. Right? It's a great way of revitalizing our grain fishing fleet. Right? Provides high-paying jobs, and it's a means of subsistence for native tribes. So I'm going to leave us here and say that when I pose this question, can seaweed save the world? I'm going to say yes, they can. But you can help. The Seaweed Superheroes, every superhero is going to need some help, right? So let's watch what we put down the drain, right? It does go straight to the oceans, right? All right. I mean, you're not supposed to touch the screen. I learned that a long time ago. We look at our, watch what you throw away, right? Because I'm going to leave you with this, that there is no way. Go someplace, right? So I'm going to leave us there and say, I'll just leave this one up and say that I hope I've convinced you that seaweed farming, aquaculture in general, is a way that we can solve a lot of issues. It's a great sustainable way of producing things that we can use in a huge number of our everyday lives. And in a few moments, you can hear, heard now in both talks about the Port of San Diego, you're going to hear about what the port is doing to launch this and help make this something that's reality in San Diego. Thank you.
So if you have a question, raise your hand and we will pass you the mic. We already have somebody with the mic there, I think. It's not yet. Pull it down to see the screen.
Perfect. Thank you. I'd love to understand what the board building seaweed farms are and how challenging the government is to produce.
Wow. So you're going to hear about some of this, I think, coming up. But so I was funded by the National Science Foundation and an incubator to try to find just this out. I was funded along with Sunken Seaweeds. And we interviewed a whole bunch of users, native tribes, seaweed farmers, people who wanted to get into seaweed farming. The greatest impediment to getting into seaweed farming right now in the state of California is two things: cost and the legality of it. Permitting for seaweed farms is difficult. It's very difficult right now. There's a number of entities that control it. Right now, we're trying to get, there's talk of what we call programmatic, which can help us get past a lot of these issues. But to put in a seaweed farm, to put in those bottom anchors, to anchor that seaweed farm, right now, it's cost prohibitive just doing it, just getting into the industry, right? So that's one of the biggest, the cost and the logistic hurdles of getting into it. Places like Alaska, it's growing tremendously, right? Different set of rules up there, right? East Coast, it's growing. So what's really done are those two big things. And California is working way there. We've been to a lot of meetings. They're aware of it. We're just trying to figure out how to, agencies and everything on board, get the costs down. Others. Yes.
In terms of cost, what are the primary costs? Regulatory,
Yeah.
put it in the ground. Right.
So there's what are the main costs of doing this, right? There's the cost of building the farm. That's not a cheap thing, right? But in order to do something, to put in a farm, let's say you identify an area of the coastline you're going to put it in, you got to do an environmental impact report, right? You can't do it. Environmental impact report can cost you a couple $100,000 to do. That's for an industry that, like any farming industry, the profit market on farming is not as good as it is in some other industry, right? And so it's hard to convince someone to say, I'm going to pay go for 2 years, pay $200,000 for an environmental impact report, then pay for all my permitting. Then I'm going to put in the farm structure. Suddenly you're $1 million or whatever you are in, right? That's a hard one. So getting the programmatic will really help us get past it. It'll remove that huge thing, that one of those huge hurdles. But those are two of the biggest costs that I would postulate.